So hi everyone, welcome to the first Sustainability Seminar Series event of the year, Counting the Cost, Financing Climate Loss and Damage. So this event explores what loss and damage means, how we support frontline communities, and also how to understand the role that climate finance has in addressing these issues. So firstly, I'll just start by introducing myself. So my name is Aditi. I'm a student at King's, but I'm also the Sustainability Education Assistant, and I will soon hand over to today's incredible moderator and speakers. But before that, just a reminder of some ground rules. So please keep your mics off when you're not speaking, and if you would like to ask a question, please type it in the chat or wait until the Q&A at the end of the event. Also, please note that we are recording this session. So this seminar is also linked to the Keats Sustainability and Climate module, which is a fully co-created and open access interdisciplinary module that covers the biggest topics in sustainability, from climate change and food to sustainable finance and social justice. If you haven't enrolled yet, we would encourage you to check it out, and we will also share the link in the chat. But for today's seminar, I'm going to hand over to our chair, Clarice, who is an alumni from King's and also an environmental lawyer.
Thank you very much, Aditi. So we're going to start this seminar with a presentation from our speakers, and then we'll finish with the Q&A for all of them. So you can type your question in the chat anytime, and we'll go through all of them at the end. We're going to start with Professor Sarah Bracking, a political economist who researches in a range of issues in international development and financial geography. A constant in her research has been the study of money and finance, beginning with the development finance and since 2011 with the emerging climate finance architecture. So over to you, Sarah. You're on mute, just Sarah. Sorry.
How many times can one person do that? Okay, hello. Nice to see everybody. I'm not an expert on loss and damage, but we have your next two speakers. So my section is just going to set the historical context for loss and damage and put it within the other landscape of climate finance. Let's see if this works. Okay, so to summarize really, climate finance comes from the public or the private sector. Its purpose is to assist society in mitigating or adapting to climate change. So it has a sort of a bifocal role. It grew in traditional development finance and then became its own subcategory around about the noughties. And the private sector also claimed to do climate finance, named at COPs as from all sources, although it's more generically called green finance in green bonds. And many climate change projects combine both public and private money, and that's called blended. And then there's also insurance and risk denominated projects, so climate risk insurance. Now, loss and damage is the newest sibling on the block, and it fits into this scape as normally a publicly funded pot. It's not entirely adaptation, but we'll get to a more detailed definition in a moment. So this is a picture of the whole landscape of climate finance from the Climate Policy Institute. Now, you'll see from this on the left-hand column, the red bits are all private flows, and most of them are at market rates. So, and they're debt denominated, so they're loans. But they count in this landscape because of the rules at the OECD DAC that labels them green. So they're seen as additional flows to what the market would normally provide, either because the development finance institutions are involved, or because they also involve some form of technical assistance. The blue lines are public, and if you see the second column, you can see adaptation there is actually less than 80 billion a year, and grants are also less than 80 billion. So the bit of this universe that's concessional is less than 10% in grant form and less than 10% in adaptation. And loss and damage falls into that segment, and at the moment is only between 5 and 20 million window for people to apply to from December the 15th. So we don't actually have a lot of grant financing available at all, which is why I generally refer to this as a spectacle of care. Because if you take that tiny proportion that's grant funded, it doesn't fund very much at all on a global scale. It actually leaves a financing gap to keep us below 2 degrees of warming. So the green zone here is how much we should be spending on climate mitigation and adaptation. The blue line is what's committed. And this is normally calculated by either combining the costs of the nationally determined contributions at COP, which would make 7.8 trillion a year, or combining the costs by sector of what you would need to do. So, but COPs generally define climate governance as being centrally about finance. They put the two together very directly. So other forms of climate governance, like banning fossil fuels, for example, don't really get a look in on this agenda. Where the money comes from, a rough chronology, very quickly, they started with debt for nature swaps in the 1980s. The Kyoto Protocol was 1997 when we got the first clean development mechanism, the first carbon market between the global south and the EU carbon trading system. In the late 1990s, we started to see more financialization of nature products like REDD+, financialization too, as I call it, from the 2000s was green bonds and capital markets. Green Climate Fund dates from 2011, insurance-linked climate dates from 2014. And here you have a whole scape today of this mitigation, adaptation, public, private, and insurance-based architecture. But there are patterns in this. So climate change mitigation funds tend to be spent in the private sector because there's normally a business case for them. And they're spent in the north, or they're given to offshore special purpose vehicles, say for infrastructure. Climate change adaptation money tends to go to the public sector and is spent in the global south. And this has patterns of discrimination and inequality, as sometimes it's tied to, say, low carbon pathways, which prevent industrialization in the global south. There are lots of funds. It's a very complicated scape. The Global Environment Facility was first, then the Green Climate Fund, then the Adaptation Fund, and now the new Fund for Loss and Damage. Most climate finance is for mitigation. Now, Paris was the landmark of where climate finance became a sort of a global project of solving climate change, more or less on its own. And it introduced these acronyms. So each country has to produce a nationally determined contribution, a plan for what it's going to do to reduce carbon. This is new acronyms. They have nationally appropriate mitigation actions in these called NAMAs. And then NAMAs can be funded through internationally tradable mitigation outcomes, or ITMOs. You won't meet an ITMO on the street, but it's a very important unit of carbon denominated, basically offsetting mechanism. So someone can produce one of these now, normally in the global south, and sell it to a high polluting country, say in Europe, and then they can use it to take down their carbon accounting to say that they're producing less carbon. So this was actually the biggest thing for me that happened at COP30. This is a picture from virtual attendance of the room in which the new global carbon markets, the regulations, the infrastructure was put in place so that ITMOs can become tradable. The thing that closed down was the CDM, the carbon fund, which came from Kyoto, which allowed global south countries to make offsets by promising to make assets less polluting. This mine in South Africa put in a sulfur retraction chimney, which was then denominated in carbon, sold as an offset project, so that global north companies could carry on polluting. There were lots of problems with the CDM, as my very critical stance take. They didn't really help local people at all. These people are still scavenging for coal for their own fires in winter. They don't have electricity yet. So it was a very bipolar sort of carbon market between the north and the south. And it's probably a good job it closed, but it did give guaranteed financing to the adaptation fund, which is now at risk. So at COP30, what was agreed most significantly is there wasn't a binding phase out of coal, oil, or gas. This is a picture of the UK offshore oil field, because there is a hypocrisy around COPs that seems to deny that the UK or Norway are actually oil states. And the blue section in the top left is the Rosebank oil field, which was given permission to be developed up to 2065 by the last government. There wasn't an agreement to close down any of this, which is producing 75% of carbon emissions globally. In the UK, I just put this in because we don't normally talk about the UK, but there is an ongoing and very hot debate about oil and gas and phasing out fossil fuels. It started in the Surrey Hills in the south, where there was an application to extend an oil rig, and it got planning permission because we don't count Scope 3 in planning law in the UK. Scope 3 are the carbon emissions that you get from burning oil. This was contested by some locals led by a woman called Sarah Finch, and it went to various courts in the UK, and eventually the Supreme Court ruled that they would have to take into account carbon emissions. This was only this year. And that's had a considerable influence already, because Rosebank is now stalled because the Scottish court in session said, if you count 3 emissions, then how can we be opening an oil field? So you can see from this graph that when Rosebank got permission to start exploring, it only counted Scope 1 and 2, which is the carbon that you use to turn the lights on so oil workers can watch Netflix. I'm only joking. Scope 3, the red column, is what it takes in carbon emissions once you burn the output. So that's now in abeyance. So this phasing out fossil fuel is slow, even in the global north, where we are more privileged and more wealthy. So obviously the global south were pushing back and saying, if you're not closing your oil fields, why do we have to? Which is where some of the opposition from the LMDC group came from. This, by the way, is a graph of carbon emissions since Paris, and you can see we haven't reached peak carbon. The Paris Agreement hasn't done very much, and we're still arguing between whose responsibility it is, states or companies. So moving swiftly on, COP30 agreed that we would have another new target for climate finance adaptation of 120 billion annually by 2035. This joins last year's future PEG targets of a new collective quantifiable goal, also by 2035, of 300 billion, not supposed to be the same money. The Baku to Bello roadmap promises 1.3 trillion, also by 2035. The point of these is they're all in the future. They're all just targets. And the actual committed climate finance this year and last year is at an historic low. So nobody is paying up, which is what makes it a spectacle. The global goal on adaptation was passed. And the loss and damage fund, and I'm going to get to Brenda and Hyacinthe, who know way more about this, was operationalized with direct access channels, but it was a sorry state of affairs in terms of actual commitments of finance to that, of less than 1 billion. And it needs 400 billion annually. And then there was a just transition mechanism. So just going back really quickly, and I'm hurrying now, if you remember principles of environmental justice, the biggest principle is CBDRRC, which is the people should pay up according to their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. This is key to Paris. And the polluter pays principle, which is part of the Stockholm Declaration, which means that people that emit are the ones that should pay. Taken together, there's nothing really at COP that says the private sector should be closing down fossil fuels or paying up for liability. And there's nothing in COP either that says that the historic polluters should pay up, or there's nothing currently forcing them to do so. The loss and damage fund has been contested for 20 years because it actually is very referent of those two principles, because it implies responsibility and liability for harm. So the developed countries have been pushing back, trying to stop this thing being put in, because since Paris, they've been trying to delete all the stuff about historic responsibility to avoid paying up for climate change. So if we look at insurance, this was what was going to pay for climate liability. This is the loss and damage where you lose everything. And that's what the loss and damage fund is supposed to be for. So adaptation funds are supposed to predict loss and prevent it happening by giving people money to adapt their lives and livelihoods. Loss and damage accepts that everything has been destroyed, and it's supposed to be to help them start a new life. This has a history in probably risk insurance, climate risk insurance, which also was supposed to pay people for things that they had permanently lost. Started in the Caribbean catastrophe risk. The donors brought in insure resilience, and then there was the Africa risk capacity. This had a direct relationship between loss, liability, and somebody paying. But it was basically abandoned because, as the IMF put it, the costs of climate change are too big for the private sector to want to insure it. In IMF speak, unmitigated climate change damages will be high. The probability of catastrophic tail risks is non-negligible. That means it could destroy huge swathes of societies, which we're starting to see. Growing agreement between economists and scientists that tail risks are material, potentially infinite costs of unmitigated climate change. So the private sector pulled back from climate insurance once it saw how costly it was going to be. Because you can't get insurance when an outcome is slow and certain rather than quick and random. So for those societies which are literally going underwater, you were not going to be able to get insurance. The only bright spot in this universe is the ICJ advisory opinion on climate obligations, which says it's now a crime internationally to not help people adapt to climate change or pay up for losses. And this is seen as a major step forward for environmental justice. I've left that on there. But my overall opinion on this is that the loss and damage fund is so underfunded, it is not going to make even a dent in the amount of loss and damage that we're already seeing. Meanwhile, the developed countries have been highly successful at pushing back on any sense of liability or climate insurance or of funding any of these new pots of funds, adaptation and loss and damage. And the only hope we have, for me, is in corporate and civil rights litigation at this point. And there's a quote from Bruno Latour to end. We can't delay action because it's coming from the future to hit us. I hope that's a good enough summary of the overall architecture. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Sarah. We will now hear from two members of the Loss and Damage Collaboration Organization. So they are Hyacinthe Niyitegeka, who is a water scientist with experience in the field of loss and damage as well as broader climate policy. And we also have Brenda Maule, who is a climate change advocate with more than 8 years of experience in policy advocacy, community engagement, partnership, climate education, and intergovernmental processes. She's also currently a negotiator for Malawi on loss and damage. Over to you. I'm going to share the slides again.
Yeah, sorry, Clarissa, I pressed the wrong button. All my fault. Sorry, Brenda.
No worries. And you should be able to take control of them, Brenda and Hyacinthe.
Thank you so much, Clarice, for that. And Sarah, I think you just leveled the ground very well and provided really a very good in-depth and detailed presentation on the loss and damage landscape or climate finance landscape in general. And thank you so much. I've also learned a lot from that. So with Hyacinthe, we'll be sharing with you the current status of loss and damage negotiations in the UNFCCC. we don't, okay, so this is what we are going to share, but to quickly just top up to what Sarah had just said, we for the sake of those that might not really understand what loss and damage, like how do you explain the concept of loss and damage in general? So to just give like a quick overview of what loss and damage is, basically you find that there's really no formally defined definition under the UNFCCC on loss and damage, but most of the times it is conceptualized as climate change impacts that are or cannot be avoided through mitigation and adaptation. So because like countries are failing to adapt or mitigate, this is where now we've gotten to the concept loss and damage. So loss and damage occurs as a result of both slow onset events as well as extreme weather events. So examples of slow onset events include sea level rise, increasing temperatures, ocean acidification, glacial retreat, salinization, land and forest degradation, biodiversity loss, just to mention a few. And extreme weather events, on the other hand, include tropical cyclones, heavy rainfall, heat waves, drought, and associated like wildfires as well as coastal flooding. So loss and damage can be both economic as well as non-economic losses and damages, which means like there's a range of harmful impact that are not easily quantified. So economic losses and damages, it's something that you can easily quantify or put a price on. For example, loss of crops or livestock or loss of infrastructure. That's something that you can say, this is how much the damages or the losses that we've actually encountered. But non-economic losses and damages, on the other hand, is something that you cannot put a price on. For example, if people are dead, you cannot say 50 people are dead and that's how much these people, their lives was amounting to. Once people are died, those lives are lost and you cannot replace lives that are lost. Same thing with like cultural heritage, health, territory, indigenous, as well as local knowledge. Biodiversity, those are things that you cannot really put a price on. So this framing actually highlights that the significant potential actually exists to avoid loss and damage by increasing mitigation ambition, as well as enhancing adaptation efforts. So loss and damage is therefore sometimes referred to like residual impacts or residual cost of climate change, not avoided by mitigation and adaptation. And it's also worth knowing that the 60th assessment report of IPCC actually defines loss and damage as the political debate under the UNFCCC to address loss and damage associated with the impacts of climate change. So the question of how the international community should deal with loss and damage is therefore like very fundamental for developing countries, especially as the science is actually very clear that man-made climate change and its impacts are accelerating faster than anticipated. So I just wanted to give a quick background of what loss and damage is for those that may not be familiar with the concept. So what has been like the evolution of loss and damage in the UNFCCC system? So here is just to give you an overview of where we're coming from. But before 2007, COP13, the concept of loss and damage actually emerged for the very first time during the drafting of the UNFCCC in 1991, when actually the Alliance of Small Island States, which is known as AOSIS, actually highlighted the importance of climate-related loss and damage, and they were actually calling for the establishment of an insurance pool for loss and damage derived from sea level rise. So their worry basically was like they were looking at the islands to say the way the sea level rise is going, the rate at which sea level rise is going, one day we'll find that our islands are gone, and like we don't exist anymore. So for them, they wanted to actually see that there's an establishment of an insurance pool to be able to address the losses and damages. So to be included in the establishment of the UNFCCC, like the convention. But although loss and damage was not mentioned in the final text of the UNFCCC in 1992, Article 4.8 actually refers to insurance as a means of helping developing countries address the adverse effects of climate change. So basically what we're seeing right now on the slide is just like, where are we coming from? So the first time that loss and damage was explicitly mentioned or like being part of the COP decision was actually at COP 13 in 2007. So that has been like the more of like the journey of loss and damage agenda and or like landscape from COP 13 in 2007 to like last year in COP29, basically, I think next year, this is going to be reviewed to actually show the impact that, the progress that has been made from like COP20, COP30. So right now, I'm going to pass on to my colleague Hyacinthe to take us through the OneSo international mechanism and Santiago network.
Thank you so much, Brenda. Hi, everyone. Thank you to Sarah as well for a great summary of, I know this is, it's a lot of things to share, but thank you so much both for the summary. So I'll talk about the WARSO International Mechanism for Loss and Damage, which is one of the loss and damage bodies under the UNFPA process. And it's the first mechanism on loss and damage established in 2013. At COP19. Its mandate is to address loss and damage, including extreme weather events and storm-set events in developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to climate change. This was established by countries and with 3 functions. First one is enhancing knowledge and understanding of comprehensive risk management approaches to address loss and damage. And the second function is to strengthen dialogue, coordination, coherence, and synergies among relevant stakeholders. So different actors working on loss and damage or climate change. And the third one, which is very important to particularly developing countries, is to enhance action and support. And among the main support needed include the finance, climate finance, technology, and capacity building. It is mainly it is guided by the executive committee, and it has five work streams based on like the main different topics. The first one is on non-economic loss and damage. This is a first work stream, and this work stream has expert group, like a group of different experts from working on loss and damage with the focus on non-economic loss and damage. Thank you to Brenda. She already explained what non-economic loss and damage is. And there's also a work stream on action and support, on human mobility, another on a strong set event, another on comprehensive risk management approaches. So parties then, after establishment of WARSO international mechanism for loss and damage, parties agreed to review how the mechanism is delivering on its mandate and functions. And then the first review took place in 2016, and the second one took place in 2019, if I remember very well. I'll have to double check. So during those 2 reviews, developing countries expressed how unsatisfied they are with WIMOs delivering at the level of the needs of developing countries. And then the review happened in 2019, led to the establishment of the Santiago network for loss and damage. This was established to focus more on action and support. When I was mentioning the functions of the WIM, WARSO International Mechanism for Loss and Damage, I mentioned that the most important function on the side of developing countries is about action and support. So when Santiago Network established at COP25 in Madrid, they agreed to on the mandate of Santiago Network, which is to catalyze the technical assistance of relevant members. So these members include organizations, bodies, networks, and experts. Then for the implementation of different approaches for averting this, averting is mitigation, minimizing is adaptation, and then addressing loss and damage at local, national, and regional levels in developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to climate change. So when it was established at COP26, which took place in Glasgow, parties agreed on the functions of the Santiago network. The first one is contribute to the implementation of the WIM. Another one is catalyzing demand-driven technical assistance. So the very main, the center of the mandate of Santiago network was to provide technical assistance to developing countries, because it was highlighted that developing countries, many of them struggle to implement approaches of addressing loss and damage. Yes, they need the finance for loss and damage. Yes, they need capacity building, but some of them don't have capacity to implement specific projects of addressing loss and damage. So they agreed on these functions. I want to go through everything, and so I would say this is a second mechanism for loss and damage. The second body under loss and damage landscape. What's the international mechanism, which is the oldest one, and Santiago network, which was established following the mechanism. And I'll hand over to Brenda again, take us through the new body under the United loss and damage. Back to you, Brenda.
Thank you so much, Hyacinthe. So as Hyacinthe has already mentioned, coming to the fund for responding to loss and damage, you find that COP27 actually established a new funding arrangement for assisting developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse impacts of climate change to be able to respond to loss and damage. So in this context, the COP decided to establish a fund for responding to loss and damage, whose mandate includes a focus on addressing loss and damage to assist developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse impacts of climate change in responding to both economic as well as non-economic losses and damages associated with the adverse impacts of climate change. And this includes extreme weather events as well as slow onset events. And it's also worth mentioning that COP27 also led to the establishment of the transitional committee, whose mandate was to work on how the fund was actually going to be operationalized. And the transitional committee actually did their work in 2024 in the lead up to COP28. So at COP28, parties operationalized the fund for responding to loss and damage as an entity entrusted with the operation of the financial mechanism to the convention, which would also save the Paris Agreement, and meaning that the fund is both accountable and do and function under the guidance of the COP and CMA. So that's why you find that every year, since last year, parties like at the end of the year going to COP, the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage actually submits a report to COP so that parties can be able to provide further guidance on how the work of the fund. And one of the mandates for the COP28 decision was to select the board for the fund, and they have been meeting. So far, they've met since last year, since its inception last year, they've met 7 times. In October this year, that was the seventh year, and they've actually done there's been a lot of progress that has been made so far, which includes the selection of the host country of the board being the Philippines, and the selection of the executive director, more of trying to establish the independent secretariat to run the fund for responding to loss and damage. So out of this, one of the notable achievements that the fund has actually achieved this year was the establishment of the Barbados implementation modalities, which was the outcome of the 5th board meeting in April this year when the board was meeting in Barbados. So the Barbados implementation program modality is the early startup phase, because the fund has just been established. started operationalizing, but then it's like a new baby. We don't know how we want it to go. Like we want like the whole sole purpose of why the fund was established, because we don't want to have, we want something different from the other financing institutions that we already, mechanisms that we have, like the GCF. Like the GCF is very complex and it takes long. While the mandate of these, or like the reason why the fund is there, we want something that's instant and something that even local communities can actually be able to access. So the BEAM is actually the pilot phase on how the fund is actually going to run in the long-term scenario. So this is like just to like a test run on how the fund is going to work like. So the BEAM will actually see the fund delivering its first set of interventions. The plan was to actually start delivering 2025 and 2026. And as it is right now, it means now the delivery is going to be in 2026. And each intervention will be between 5 to 20 million US dollars. And the BEAM is actually going to support bottom-up led approaches. And at the same time, 50% minimum allocation is for the seeds and LDCs, and the interventions are actually going to be in form of grants. And the call for proposals has actually been launched in Belem, and officially the fund will be open on the 15th of December, which will run for 6 months. So that means it will close on the 15th of June next year. And the plan is to make sure like there's direct access through direct budget support for developing countries. So basically that's it for the BEAM. So now I'm looking at what Hyacinthe has presented on like the WIM, and then we have the Santiago network, and then we have the fund for responding loss and damage. These are like 3 bodies under the loss and damage ecosystem. So how can you be able to relate to all of them? And right now, if you go through the decision from COP30, there's an element of complementarity, coherence, and coordination between all these 3 bodies. So how can you be able to like explain the loss and damage ecosystem in the simplest way possible that we could find? So basically, you find that the WIM is like the brain that is there to be able, more of like a governance arm or like policy arm of loss and damage. And then you find the Santiago network being like the connector. You have Hyacinthe mentioned about organization, bodies, networks, and experts that are there to provide technical assistance. And then you have the fund, which is there to provide resources. So in a simple way, how I put it like in my head is that, or how I easily explain to someone is like, let's say you have a vehicle, right? The vehicle is there, you want it to run, right? And then the moment it breaks down, you need a mechanic to be able to provide services to the vehicle. And then how are you going to pay the mechanic? That's where the resources, you need the resources to be able to pay the mechanic. So you have the WIM as the vehicle, more of like the governance. We're not developing knowledge products, all the policies that are there. And then you need a mechanic to be able to service this vehicle. This is where the Santiago network and the experts that are coming in and countries are being able to like apply for technical assistance. So you've gone to a mechanic to say, you know, you're applying for technical assistance to say, I need you to service my vehicle. And then where are you going to get the money? This is where the fund for responding to loss and damage is actually coming in so that you can have resources to be able to pay to the mechanic. And then lastly, to just talk about the loss and damage negotiation status at COP30. I know Sarah has already gone through this, but to just explain that, so the negotiations at COP30 in Belem actually saw the complete the adoption of the 3rd review of the WIM, which is something that has taken us about 2 years. We're supposed to have the 3rd review last year, but because countries couldn't really come to a consensus, understanding that the UNFCCC process is not a voting process, you need to, like, it's through consensus. So whether it's only one country that's not agreeing, if that country is not agreeing, then you cannot adopt that. So that's what happened last year, and we ended up getting Rule 16. So this year, that has been what's been going on, and countries finally agreed, and now we have an adoption on the 3rd review of the WIM. So why is this important? Hyacinthe already mentioned that the 2nd review of the WIM actually is what established the Santiago network of loss and damage. So some of the elements, important elements that are in there includes the loss and damage status report, which is also going to be known as the loss and damage gap report. We know UNEP produces the adaptation gap report and the emissions gap report, but those were not agreed under UNFCCC. But parties still found it relevant to say we need evidence advocacy to say what is the science for loss and damage? Where are we going to learn like best practices, what's happening maybe in Latin America, in Asia Pacific, in Africa, in all other countries, so that we can be able to understand how other countries are also like addressing loss and damage. And there are also the work to do, Hyacinthe mentioned about the task force on action and support. How is the task force going to be able to deliver their work to make sure that they are really on top of their work that's to provide action and support to countries, and also issues to do with coordination, coherence, and complementarity among the three bodies, as well as the finance to be able to make sure that the Santiago network and WIM are able have resources to fully deliver their mandate. So at the same time, COP30 actually fell short on various issues, which includes no commitment to urgently scale up loss and damage finance and support. Sarah mentioned about the gap that we have right now. We need 400 billion US dollars every year to be able to address loss and damage. And right now, how much do we have in the pot? About 800 million US dollars. And you find that for example, in our Malawian context, our 2023 PDNA report actually shows that we need about 660 million just for Malawi to address Cyclone Freddy, not any other cyclones that we've gone through. So what the money that we have in the pot right now in the fund is not even enough to be able for developing countries to cope with the intensity of loss and damage right now. And only 2 pledges were made. Spain provided 20 million euros to the fund, and Switzerland made a pledge of 1 million Swiss to the Santiago network. So what we need is a lot of commitments, and not just the pledges, but also turning those pledges into contributions so that the money is available to sustain the fund for responding to loss and damage. So lastly, I'll turn back to Hyacinthe to close us with our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brenda. Thank you everyone for following. I know it might sound like a bit technical. Please feel free to ask specific questions. We'll be happy to break down everything. So we are from the Loss and Damage Corporation. We already shared about this. So the Loss and Damage Corporation, briefly tell you about ourselves, about the network. It's a global network with over 350 members at the moment, with different backgrounds in climate change work. Our belief is that there is enough money in the world to address loss and damage, not only loss and damage, to tackle climate change. So with that belief, we came together to work together. I mean, as a team, to advocate for enough funding to advocate for enough loss and damage finance in developing countries. So to do that, in order to do that, the first thing we do is shed light on the complex UNFCCC negotiations, and we provide thought leadership to drive ambitious policy outcomes on loss and damage. We do this through we work with the negotiators, particularly from the European countries. I mentioned this before. We realized that negotiators from the European countries lack enough capacity to engage in the UNFCCC process. You can find that one negotiator is following different thematic areas. For those who are not familiar with UNFCCC negotiations, there are different there are different thematic areas, including, for example, adaptation. Sarah mentioned about the carbon markets. That's, I think, under Article 6. There's now loss and damage, mitigation, and there's gender and many others. So you could find that one negotiator is throwing all those, or like more than one thematic areas. So what do? We support them, we advise them, and then for the negotiations that are complex, particularly loss and damage, we make things much easier for them to understand. Then we have different social media platforms where we communicate with clarity and the needs of developing countries. And then we share, they reach out to us with their needs, what they would like to see as an outcome, and then if people see and other loss and damage key moments, then we communicate that. Then another thing is our platform enables different stakeholders from diverse backgrounds to collaborate at a global scale. We believe in collaboration, so we can all work together to effectively address loss and damage. Another thing is we support, I already mentioned this, we're device negotiators to ensure that they are equipped to advocate for what their communities on the ground need. And we provide direct support to countries. This is very important. We already mentioned Santiago Network, which provides technical assistance to developing countries that are vulnerable to climate change. So we have been, this year particularly, we have supported three countries to develop their technical assistance request to the Santiago Network. How this works, for example, now Fund for Loss and Damage is going to start accepting the call for accepting proposals. So we support them to develop technical, like a request or proposals that will help them apply for the fund and for finance under the fund responding to loss and damage. So I've been doing a lot of things, but to highlight a few, I have highlighted just a few of them. So that's the end of our presentation. If you have any question, we are happy to respond. Thank you so much. Back to you, Caris.
Thank you very much, Brenda and Hyacinthe, for this presentation. I'm glad that we have a first question, because the first one is always the more difficult one. So we had one from Evan, and don't be sorry for a long question. It's always interesting. So Evans writes that he just graduated from an MSc in Environment Politics Development at King's College. He writes, I'd like to thank the panel for the incredible discussion. Would like to ask, with regards to the recent flooding in Southeast Asia and South Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Sri Lanka, what would you say about how climate finance should be done in rebuilding disaster-hit region towards a more sustainable economy and to drive developing countries away from uncontrolled deforestation, fossil fuel-dependent development? And he finishes by adding that he comes from Jakarta, Indonesia, currently seeing public anger over Indonesian government's failing response to the floods and historic deforestation. So a question there about what should we do and what can we do after a disaster? Is it only rebuilding, but how do we also promote a more sustainable development while rebuilding? And what do you see as solution for that? Thank you, Evan, for your question. Sarah, Brenda, Hyacinthe, anyone can speak.
I'll say something. So first, Evan, congratulations. That's an MA that I work on, so it's nice to see an alumni. Your question is obviously big enough for a PhD, to say that. I think that Indonesia does have a national disaster risk program, but it's not part of a sovereign risk pool. So the problem with this degree of flooding is that a lot of governments are forced to borrow money on capital markets quite quickly to pay. And then because their climate risk actually rises following one of these events, the cost also rises over time. So you get into a further debt trap. So that's not good news in terms of disaster relief and reconstruction financially. On the upside, I mean, Jakarta is a very climate vulnerable city. There are ways of increasing resilience to buildings, roads, transports, and infrastructure into the future. And I mean, aside from the money, if climate change was mainstreamed into other ministries of state, into other departments, more deeply in many countries, then we would be able to cut back on some climate risk, which is not, the overall positive answer. But if you see climate finance as siloed and on the side, then it doesn't look like there's very much money. But if you think of all of the public finances and all of the global private assets under management, it's about 160 trillion, 180 trillion, we're actually talking about between 4 and 8% that you would have to repurpose to start to deal with this crisis. And if we could shift all those assets under management and all government funding into building back in a resilient way, as some of the side events at Bellum proved, we can reduce some sort of risk. I say that, but the only overall answer is to stop this madness of the fossil fuel economy. I mean, until we take out the 17% of global assets that are fossil fuel based, this is just going to get worse. And yeah, not the best answer, I don't feel, but it's a very complicated question.
And Brenda, I'm not sure if you want to touch on what also your organization does in this situation.
Yeah, I can come in, then Brenda will add. So I think it's my Sarah. That's amazing. That's an amazing answer. I would add that I would believe that even though we are experiencing loss and damage, we still believe in mitigation as well as adaptation. So it's crucial for countries to keep the countries to make sure they are carrying out adaptation as well as mitigation, like for example, early warning systems and the other mechanisms or mechanisms in place. That's important. So if I say in terms of climate finance, countries have been requesting for tripling, for example, adaptation finance, and we already heard about mitigation, like carbon markets and others. So those are so important, and we can't leave them behind. So I'm not sure if I'm going to also provide a great answer, but I wanted to emphasize the need of adaptation at this moment than before, so we can avoid the future loss and damage. Brenda, if you have something to add, please come in. Thank you so much.
I feel like Sarah and you, Hyacinthe, have really articulated, you've done justice to that question. But what I can only add is that there's also a serious, like as Sarah mentioned, to say there's need to also look deeper into the linkages between action towards mitigation, adaptation, as well as DRR, to say, and then approaching this whole thing transdisciplinarily and not working in silos, to say, in as much as we are there to say, okay, we want to rebuild our cities or our countries, but it shouldn't just be climate change experts doing this all alone. Otherwise, then it's going to be a failed game. And at the same time, also, how are we preparing ourselves as countries? We are calling for loss and damage fund. We are calling for adaptation fund. We increasing of the finances, but as countries as well, how are we putting our houses in order? Do we have frameworks or strategies that we think, even if the resources are available, we'll be able to put those resources where it's really needed? And how are we channeling the resources to actually reach the communities that really need the resources also? I had like the similar conversation 2 weeks ago. No, last week, I was also talking to some young women negotiators on this as well, to say we're doing advocacy and all of that. But when we talk about, for example, the fund for responding to loss and damage, the call for proposals is on the 15th of December, and countries, not that they don't know, but how many countries actually, like there was a simple instruction to say, make sure every country has appointed a national designated authority who is going to be there to support and be that bridge between the secretariat and the country. And if you go on the FRD secretariat website, only a few countries have their secretariat appointed, and that actually also shows us like our lack of seriousness when we for the things that we are advocating for. And how are we preparing ourselves for that? And then we'll wait for last minute things to be able to tap into opportunities. So it's also good to make sure that the opportunities that are there, we also position ourselves ready to tap into those opportunities. And otherwise, I think we'll just be singing the same song each and every year. So that's what I can say and add to what has already been said. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these really interesting answer. Just before Malcolm's question, I just wanted to know, because I know, Sarah, that you're going to be leaving a bit early. I was just asking, because like of the different levels of loss and damage, we spoke a lot about the international levels, but do you know if some countries have put that in national levels, organizing some sort of mechanism for polluters, being companies or people, paying for some project? Do you know if there's another level that this loss and damage mechanism are put into place other than COP and international level? Maybe not. I don't know.
I think the loss and damage category is a particular international COP type thing, and it's designed quite rightly to pursue environmental justice on behalf of people that are losing everything. And it's a crime, really, that it doesn't have more funding. But I think it certainly has predecessors in country, because a lot of the work that it will pay for was previously managed under disaster risk and disaster risk reduction forums, disaster resilience forums. So most cities, I think, everywhere have municipalities. I mean, there are lots of plans to manage disasters. It's only that, in the past, there weren't so many. And as Brenda said, if the cost of one typhoon, flood, cyclone, drought is exceeding all of the budget of what used to cover, say, a 20-year period, the problem is that the losses are outpacing any of the prior financial resources that have been set aside before. So Mozambique, for example, and Itai, I mean, there used to be a flood there once every 25 years. Now it's once every 5. Or Durban, where I worked for some time, they have rain bombs now. That they used to be a 10-15 year thing, and now they're coming in every 3 or 4. And last year, 465 people died in one flooding, one downpour event. Now, they have a resilience and disaster management plan, the municipality, but the problem is that they can't build back houses quick enough, and they can't respond quick enough even to compensate the people from the last time before the next one comes, which is why you need international support, because that's what the principles of environmental justice say should be happening. Getting the private sector to pay, I mean, there's 2 oil refineries in South Durban that have messed up the whole ecosystem. They're escaping any sort of rehabilitation at the moment, which is the other way of getting financing for loss and damage, is to, well, in South Africa, it's called rehabilitation or decommissioning. Once you're decommissioning a dirty asset, you should actually have to pay for approximate loss and damage. That's always been a difficult ask, and there's only been a few civil rights cases globally for either environmental damage or now increasingly climate litigation that have worked. Although there is one carrying on at the moment in the Netherlands against Shell, which looks quite hopeful. I think the tail risk of fossil fuels will be the thing that closes them down. If we can prove to these companies that the cost, say, as it was with asbestos or tobacco, 20 years from now or 30 years from now, based on the ICJ ruling, is going to be so big they need to stop, then hopefully we can cut down the frequency of these extreme weather events. So yes, there is a precedent, that was a long answer, in disaster risk activities, which used to be a subcategory of development, and loss and damage is maybe taking some of that mantle moving forward.
Thank you very much. Do you want to add anything, Brenda or Yasa? Otherwise, we'll move to Malcolm's question. Then a very interesting question from Malcolm, who's an independent consultant and ex-climate negotiator. He asked, in the margin of COP30, was there any talk of expanding the sources of fund, given that some of the countries not in Annex 1, so mostly developing countries, are now in a position to contribute and are also significant emitters? So how do we navigate loss and damage with this question of being polluters, not being legally in the category of payers? Who's taking the lead?
Okay, I'll speak very briefly. I wasn't at COP. I was referring negotiations closely, so I don't know exactly what has been discussed, everything discussed in the rooms, but I'll put Brenda on spot. But before that, I'd like to just highlight, to stress that provision of climate finance is related to the historical emissions. And this is why it has been different countries, at least like some intel I have in different discussions. For example, review of the World International Mechanism at COP30, parties started, they wanted to highlight ICJ, advisory opinion to just to mainly include how legal it is for countries to provide climate finance, and also referring to the Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement. I don't remember the wording exactly, but it also calls on it provides legal basis for provision of climate finance and mandating that the Annex 1 countries shall provide financial resources to assist European countries with respect to mitigation and adaptation. But given that now we are in the era of loss and damage should also be part of that. So I read a few submissions regarding Baku to Belém roadmap under the new Creative Quantified goal before COP. There were some of the groups from developing countries highlighted that there should be other sources of finance, not really from developing countries. Some of them were not very specific on the other countries that can provide finance, but they highlighted that there's a need of other sources of finance, for example, different companies that are have been historically emitting, emitting. So I mean, it's not that great, but I think in the rooms there might have been some discussions on that. But if you have any intel on that, you please come in. Thanks. Just I wanted to stress that still developed countries should take the lead in providing climate finance based on their historic emissions. To you, Brenda.
I wish I had a better answer for this. It's a tricky question, but yes, it's true. And I know that NCQG is not really just pinning on like developed countries, but also making sure that everybody is able to put something into the pot. So maybe it's something that we could also use that as the basis for the argument. And you could also see how the developing countries that people are referring to in here, how they didn't like the whole idea of having ICJO reference in the preamble for the WIM EXCOM, because people don't want to be committed. That was going to take them to task, and that was going to be like, a binding principle in to actually call on them to also be committed to this. And the fact that there was a very strong pushback on this, it really shows that people really love to talk, but don't want to take up responsibility and be committed in as much as they're developing, but they have the capacity to be able to provide finances. So yes, I would say people, as Hyacinthe said, there's been like a call to make sure that there's also, we can use other innovative sources of funding, like Sarah highlighted in her in her presentation, because right now what we need are the 3 S's. Like, we need to make sure that loss and damage finance is covering the whole scope of loss and damage. It's delivered at the speed and scale of the needs for developing countries. So that's what we really need to call for. And right now, I think we really need the momentum that countries, civil societies, heads of state actually showed in Dubai when we were operationalizing the loss and damage the fund, to actually like ensure that the momentum is there. Otherwise, I feel like over the years since Dubai, the momentum is really going down. And before we know it, I don't know, we might end up having the loss and damage agenda like thrown out in the bush. So yeah, we really need to continue pushing for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now a question from Rosa, who asks, what can we do as student or staff at King's or in the UK to encourage countries to move away from fossil fuels and start funding loss and damage properly? Do you have any campaign, or do you know of initiative, or is it lobbying? Do you know if we could do something to help?
I would say most of the times is the campaigns calling on the responsible people to actually act on this. That has really brought us or helped in pushing some of the agenda items. I mean, let's take the ICJO. For example, it was the university students in Vanuatu, right, who started this whole thing, and then actually the whole world actually coming together and actually seeing the importance of that, and to actually, make sure like we continue pushing on this. And right now there's a few Fill the Fund campaign that has been started by the CSO, or like constituency civil society constituency people. And I think that's one of the the best platform as well to like engage. They're like press releases, they're like so many things that people are doing, like advocacy, reaching out to different stakeholders to make sure that they come on board and call on people to actually fund for loss and damage. So there's a website on Fill the Fund, and we have, there are like social media platforms as well as the collaboration. We are part of in the steering committee in supporting this and pushing for this. So I think those are the platforms that we can take advantage of. And even as King's College as well, you as students, you can come up with like a campaign. And if you want us from organizations or like negotiators to actually support you in a way, please, you can always reach out to the collaboration and see how best we can work together, and see if there are any other stakeholders that we might link you up to. So I think that's what I can say.
I can also say, can I add to, thank you so much, Brenda. I say this is a very good starting point. Having these kinds of conversations is so important. So thank you so much for to the courage for organizing these kinds of discussions. I'd like to say just to stress the importance of advocacy. We remember at COP27 in Egypt, when the fund for responding to loss and damage was established. Back then, it was called Loss and Damage Fund. When co-president was addressing, was speaking, he highlighted that this was not good, that it wasn't going to be possible without the strong advocacy and work of civil society organizations. And we know countries from different countries can push for better outcomes and phasing out fossil fuels, loss and damage finance, adaptation finance, among other things that will help the countries to tackle climate change, but also having the support from outside the UNFCCC process is very important. So think about that is super useful. And also, as Brenda said, there are many campaigns or groups you can engage with. Some of them are for young people, and there's, for example, sun damage Youth Coalition. It's a global coalition of young people came together to push for best outcome on loss and damage, among many others. So if you could join them, or you can just start your own campaign. We know the voice, always everyone's voice matters in this process. Yeah, I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really interesting. After the ends of this seminar, we want to do stuff and really get into it. So it's really nice to have some ideas. If we have another question in chat, we can have a last one. Otherwise, I wanted to ask you, because your coalition is really doing work on the ground, and I would like to know, do you have any examples of projects that can be financed? And do you across the world know a variety of different projects that can be financed and help with this loss and damage funds? Do you have anything that you worked on and would like to share, or specific testimonies of people helped?
Thank you so much, Harriet. So we don't really work directly with communities on the ground, but our members include different people working with communities on the ground. So we don't have a specific example of a project that can be funded, but we know that those people need that of support, technical support. They need capacity building, as well as finance to implement projects on the ground. During the discussions, they would share what's going on, what they're working on. So at the moment, we don't have specific project. And just wanted to highlight that what we know is that many developing countries are using their own resources, limited resources. They're diverting the resources from other important projects to address loss and damage. For example, what our colleague mentioned about Sri Lanka, I'm sure they were not ready for that. So I saw that in our country, Rwanda, when we were hit by flooding, which killed many people, I think around 150, and destroyed very many infrastructure and other properties. So we know they need that kind of support, and we will start. I believe we will start hearing more about specific projects once countries are submitting their proposal to the fund. But hopefully, for those countries that will be able to submit proposals, will be able to get also funding under the FRD. Rena, do you have something else to add? I don't want to put her on spot. I'll stop there. Back to you, Clarice.
No, I think Hyacinthe has explained like the mode of work that we do. We don't really work in communities, but we work with stakeholders that are working in communities. And our main role is maybe connect them with like other stakeholders that can really support the projects that they're working on. So yeah.
Thank you very much. And if we don't have any question in the chat, we could end there. Just one last thing. Do you have anything to promote, like a report that you have, or can we follow you on social media to see what you do or your organization does? Feel free to say it now, because your report and your website has loads of resources, but if you want to pinpoint to people to see, for them to learn a bit more about it, feel free to say them now or leave them in the chat.
I say thank you so much for sharing our website. It has a lot of information, as you said. If you're interested in loss and if any of you is interested in loss and damage discussions, you'll find, like I say, almost everything you need to know about this and how you can engage, particularly about what different countries need. So we also see the links to other social media platforms. We provide, our comms team provides a lot of information. They try to break down the technical terms into simple and understandable words. So you can I mean, you can find everything on the website. You have LinkedIn, Facebook, you have Twitter, and many others. So feel free to navigate through them. You'll find like almost everything you need. And feel free to reach out. You have a specific question, you'll find you have the info email address. It's also on our website. If you would like to know anything specific, you can always reach out to us. Just like to tell you that we are going to we had to take a leave as an entire team from 19th to the beginning of January. Otherwise, any other time, you can always reach out to us. And the last thing I would like to mention is that I'm super excited to have this kind of conversation with you all. It's super important to have it. That's a very beginning of engaging in these kinds of discussions, and do something tangible to support vulnerable communities on the ground facing impacts of climate change. And also, we know that this is not only affecting developing countries, it's also affecting some communities from developed countries. So this is, we should be into this together, push together, and see that, particularly for young people like us, this is to be sure of how our future is going to look like. If things keep getting worse, that means we don't have anywhere to go. So let's keep doing this together and support those that are not, okay, I don't want to talk about this, but I'll say we know there are lots of communities on the ground who don't even understand what's going on. So who are traumatized with what's happening to them, they don't know about climate change. So for those who had the privilege to know this kind of information, let's make use of it possibly to to advocate for them. Thank you so much.
Brenda,
Yeah, thank you
to
so
take
much.
over? Brenda, you want to finish on that?
No, I think that's
perfect.
fine. Yes.
Okay, so yeah, I'll just wrap up the seminar. First of all, I'd like to say a big thank you to Clarice, Brenda, Sarah, and Hyacinthe for sharing their insightful thoughts and work, and of course for all of you for attending as well. Just before I wrap up, just a final few opportunities for you all to get involved in. As I mentioned at the start of the session, make sure you're registered for the Sustainability Seminar Series to receive all the future invites, and the next session will actually take place in January, and it's quite exciting exciting, so I hope to see many of you there. You can also subscribe to our newsletter and follow us on all of our social media channels to make sure that you don't miss out on other events that are coming up. And finally, you can also join the King's Climate Action Network to co-create the university's climate action journey and also volunteer in projects around energy, schools engagement, education, supply chain, and even cycling, and we will share all of the links in the chat as well. And please do fill in our feedback form if possible as well. So that's all for today, and thank you all, and hope to see you soon. And thank you, Clarice, as well.
Thank you very much. See you in the next seminar.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.